Welcome to the Paul Chandler Show, everyone. I'm your host, Paul Chandler. We've been living in a COVID-19 world for a little over a year now. However, though, with the 2021 ICD-10-SAM books publications, no matter if it's the ebook or the good old paper book with nice little spirals on the end, this is the first year for the coding manual where we have diagnosis codes for COVID-19. So in this episode of the show, we're going to be reviewing the diagnosis code sets and all the different options that we have for COVID-19 and the documentation requirements. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. And now we're going to take a look at coding COVID-19 in 2021. The Pfizer vaccine code for the vaccine itself is 91300. The first dose administration code is 0001A, and the second dose 0002A. The Moderna Inc. vaccination for COVID-19, the vaccine code itself, 91301. Their first dosage is 0011A for the administration and 0012A for the second dose administration. And the AstraZeneca vaccine code for the vaccine itself for COVID-19, 91302, and their first dose administration, 0021A, and their second dose administration code, 0022A. And as the 2021 coding manuals, being the first manuals with the coronavirus as permanent codes, we have the new section 1C1G for the coronavirus infections. And as far as coding it, for example, only code confirmed cases, code only confirmed diagnosis of the 2019 novel coronavirus disease as documented by the provider or documentation of a positive COVID-19 test result. For confirmed diagnosis, assign code U07.1 COVID-19. This is an exception to the hospital inpatient guideline, section 2H. In this context, confirmation does not require documentation of a positive test result for COVID-19. The provider's documentation that the individual has COVID-19 is sufficient. If the provider documents suspected, possible, probable, or inconclusive COVID-19, do not assign code U07.1. Instead, code the signs and symptoms reported and a cross-reference to guideline IC 1G1G. For the sequencing of codes involving the coronavirus, when COVID-19 meets the definition of a principal diagnosis, use code 07.1, COVID-19, should be sequenced first, followed by the appropriate codes for associated manifestations, except when another guideline requires that certain codes be sequenced first, such as obstetrics, sepsis, or transplant complications. For COVID-19 infection that progresses to sepsis, see section 1C1D, sepsis, severe sepsis and septic shock. See section 1C15S for COVID-19 infection in pregnancy, childbirth, and the perineum. See section 1C16H for COVID-19 infection of newborn. And for COVID-19 infection of a lung transplant patient, see Section 1C19G3A, transplant complications other than kidney. So you can see here, we do have a lot of new guidelines involving for COVID-19. And we also have acute respiratory manifestations of COVID-19. When the reason for the encounter admission is a respiratory manifestation of COVID-19, assign code U07.1, COVID-19 as the principal first listed diagnosis, and assign codes for the respiratory manifestations as additional diagnosis. The following conditions are examples of common respiratory manifestations of COVID-19. Pneumonia, acute bronchitis, and lower respiratory infection. And I'm not going to read them word for word here, but notice though how there are coding guidelines to state the sequencing for coding coronavirus or COVID-19 when a patient has pneumonia, acute bronchitis, lower respiratory infection, as well as acute respiratory distress syndrome and acute respiratory failure here as well. Now, in non-respiratory manifestations of COVID-19, when the reason for the encounter or admission is not respiratory manifestation of COVID-19, assign code U07.1 COVID-19 as the principal first listed diagnosis and assign codes for the manifestations as additional diagnosis. Regarding exposure for COVID-19, for asymptomatic individuals with actual or suspected exposure to COVID-19, assign code Z20.828, contact with and suspected exposure to other viral communicable diseases. For symptomatic individuals with actual or suspected exposure to COVID-19 and the infection has been ruled out, or test results are inconclusive or unknown, assign code Z20.828, contact with and suspected exposure to other viral communicable diseases. See Guideline 1C21C1, Contact Exposure, for additional guidance regarding the use of Category Z20 codes. If COVID-19 is confirmed, see Guideline 1C, 1G, 1A. For screening for COVID-19, during the COVID-19 pandemic, a screening code is generally not appropriate. For encounters for COVID-19 testing, including preoperative testing, code as exposure to COVID-19. Coding guidance will be updated as new information concerning any changes in the pandemic status becomes available. For coding for signs and symptoms without definitive diagnosis of COVID-19, for patients presenting with any signs symptoms associated with COVID-19, such as fever, etc., but a definitive diagnosis has not been established, assign the appropriate code for each of the presenting problems and symptoms, such as cough, shortness of breath, or fever, unspecified. If a patient with signs and symptoms associated with COVID-19 also has an actual or suspected contact with or exposure to COVID-19, assign Z20.828, contact with and suspected exposure to other viral communicable diseases as an additional code. For asymptomatic individuals who test positive for COVID-19, see Guideline 1C, 1G, 1A. Although the individual is asymptomatic, the individual has tested positive and is considered to have the COVID-19 infection. Just a little bit more information on the new COVID-19 guidelines. For patients with a history of COVID-19, assign code Z86.19, personal history of other infectious or parasitic diseases. And for individuals who previously had COVID-19 and are being seen for follow-up evaluation and COVID-19 results are negative, assign code Z09, encounter for follow-up examination after completed treatment for conditions other than malignant neoplasm, and, notice this says and, not or, and Z86.19, personal history of other infectious and parasitic diseases. And the last part here regarding COVID-19. For an encounter for antibody testing that is not being performed to confirm a current COVID-19 infection, nor is a follow-up test after resolution of COVID-19, assign Z01.84 encounter for antibody response examination. Following the applicable guidelines above, if the individual is being tested to confirm a current COVID-19 infection, and for follow-up testing after COVID-19 infection, see Guideline 1C, 1G, 1J. Here we have a short list of the cheat sheet, if you will, for the ICD-10-CM codes for COVID-19. Now, this list here does not include any of the OB/GYN codes in the O chapter, or the chapter with the codes that begin with O. Those were discussed previously in the ICD-10 guidelines that we looked at for COVID-19. But here we have, just like it would look like in your diagnosis book, U07.1 for COVID-19, with cross-references here to childbirth and pregnancy and the peritoneum and newborn options, and how it does have an excludes one. Note that there is also the notation to use additional code to identify pneumonia or other manifestations. So we have the U07.1 code for COVID-19, as well as Z11.52 for a counter for screening for COVID-19, Z20.822 for contact with and suspected exposure to COVID-19, Z86.16 for personal history of COVID-19, M35.81 for multisystem inflammatory syndrome, or MIS, M-I-S, M35.89 for other specified systematic involvement of connective tissue, as well as J12.82, pneumonia due to coronavirus disease for 2019.
Thank you for taking the time today out to watch the education on COVID-19 diagnosis and the coding and the documentation requirements. And just like I mentioned in the PowerPoint video itself, that to go to the paulchandlershow.com/episode 102, that's all one word, the paulchandlershow.com/episode 102, and you can download a one-page PDF, nice little cheat sheets, if you will, of the COVID-19 diagnosis codes and the documentation requirements. So from all of us here, the cast and crew, thank you for watching the Paul Chandler Show, and have an awesome rest of your day.